What makes music music? When I talk about music here, I'm thinking mainly of Western music. I don't know enough about music from other cultures to be able to comment sensibly. I don't know if what I'm about to say applies to music from other cultures. But in terms of our Western music, I would identify three characteristics that distinguish music from other kinds of sounds. The first of these is rhythm. The human brain has an astonishing capacity to identify patterns. This is obviously true of vision. For example, most of us are very good at identifying and differentiating between faces. We're able to identify a deer standing in dappled light in a forest. Clearly, this ability to recognize patterns is highly adaptive. But perhaps even more astonishing is our capacity to recognize patterns over time. This is obviously important for understanding and appreciating music. And it begins with rhythm. Somehow we know that each of these sounds is separated by the same length of time. And this is rhythm. We have a built-in time sense. When I was discussing savants in an earlier video, I referred to a woman who was able to tell the time any time of day or night to the second. Clearly, she had an exceptional internal clock. But rhythm shows that we all have this internal sense of time. We may not know what the precise time interval is between those hand claps, but we know it's the same time. We know it's a pattern, a rhythm, rather than just a random series of sounds. Some people have attributed this to the rhythmic sound of someone walking, and so they link the development of music to when apes first began to walk upright. Maybe, but I think it's much more likely to be linked to our own built-in rhythm, our heartbeat, or perhaps even to the heartbeat of our mother while we're still in the womb. I think this would explain our deeply instinctive and primal response to rhythm. The second aspect of music is melody, and closely related to that, harmony. This has to do with the pitch of the sound we're hearing, and more importantly, the relationship between the pitch of each sound. At a moment in time when a chord is played, we have a sense of the relationship between the notes which make up the chord. We have a sense of whether those notes fit well together, whether they harmonize, or whether they are perhaps discordant. We intuitively sense something about the mathematical relationship, the ratios of frequencies between the individual notes. For example, the note A, which has a frequency of 440 Hertz, and the note E, with 660 Hertz, form a ratio of 2 to 3. It's a perfect fifth. It sounds right to us. If it were 2 to 3.5, it just wouldn't sound right. We would think the guitar or the piano was out of tune. Somehow, intuitively, we can sense these numbers, these frequencies, and the relationship between them. When we consider melody, time comes into play again. In this case, we have a sense of the relationship between notes over time. When we hear a series of notes, we have a sense of what note, or perhaps one of several, comes next in that sequence, especially if it completes the pattern. Then there's a sense of satisfaction when one of those notes does indeed appear. There can also be a sense of surprise when another note, an unexpected note, completes the sequence. This can also be pleasant, a pleasant surprise. It can be very frustrating when the sequence is not completed. But this can also be used in interesting ways to create certain responses in the listener. Whether the pattern is left incomplete or is completed in an unexpected way, our response still depends on our awareness of such patterns over time, and also on our awareness of the relationships between notes. Where does this appreciation of melody come from? Well, listen to this. Where does music come from? Where does music come from? Where does music come from? There's already both rhythm and melody in our speech patterns. So perhaps the leap from speech to music is not so great. Studies of the way that mothers speak to infants have identified patterns of pitch and rhythm that are very musical. These tunes are often individually distinct, maybe even unique. So from birth, if not before, certain melodies and rhythms are going to be associated with your mother's speech. I wonder, does this affect the kind of music that you'll particularly like in the future? Finally, the third factor that's important in differentiating between music and other sounds is repetition. This is already present to some extent in the idea of rhythm. It's not really rhythm if there's not some repetition of the pattern. But it's also true of melody. If you think back to the words that I spoke earlier to show how speech is already musical, that wouldn't really have worked if I'd said those words only once. It was only when they were said 2 or 3 times that you really begin to recognize the musical quality of the sounds. Repetition is essential, to my understanding of music anyway. The length of the pattern that's repeated can vary, of course. If it's too long, I may not notice the pattern, at least until I've listened to that piece of music several times. If I'm listening to a piece of classical music, it's always pleasing when a musical motif is repeated at various points throughout the music, even if it's varied slightly. In fact, variation makes it even more interesting. If the same melodic pattern is just repeated identically over and over, I become inured to it, maybe even bored. But if it's varied slightly, maybe it's repeated in a different key or at a different pace, or it's interrupted, or it's played by a different instrument, or maybe just one note is changed, then the pattern becomes much more interesting. But for this to occur, we have to first of all recognize the basic pattern. And it isn't really a pattern until it's repeated. We love patterns. We've evolved to be sensitive to patterns, both visual and auditory, both in space and over time. In fact, to such an extent that we see patterns when there aren't even patterns there, like bunnies in the clouds and so on. Music is an expression of pattern in many different ways. To some extent, this is surely a natural extension of the rhythm and intonation of ordinary speech. It also mirrors our own bodily rhythms. Certainly, I would suggest the rhythm of our heart, and maybe also the rhythm of our walking. Certainly also, it's not only our minds that react to music, but our bodies too. I don't know about you, but I find it difficult to remain still when music is playing, or, as you can see, when I'm talking. So there's some positive feedback there. The rhythms of our bodies feed into music, and music feeds right back into the rhythm of our bodies.